On February 27th, 1860, Abraham Lincoln gave what might have been the most important speech of his life at the Cooper Union, or the Cooper Institute in Manhattan, New York. He had been invited to give a speech in the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn as part of a series. The speech had been moved, and he was now delivering this address in Manhattan before an audience of the city's leading political and philanthropic figures. For a Springfield attorney and a leading Illinois politician, this was an opportunity to present himself on a national stage. Lincoln was already, by that point, discussed about and noted as a potential Republican presidential candidate, but this would be a test for him to see whether he could deliver the kind of speech in New York that had already made him famous because of the way he had delivered them in Illinois during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, or in the next year in 1859 in other states like Ohio. He'd become a pretty renowned orator, but New York was the biggest stage in the country. And so Lincoln gave a long speech. The speech is too long to discuss in a short, close reading, but I'll pick out sections of the speech that reveal elements of what Lincoln was trying to do. So early on, near the very top of the speech, he refers to a speech in Ohio that was reported in the New York Times by Senator Douglas. Of course, this is a reference to Stephen Douglas, his great adversary, the man he had debated in 1858, the debates that had continued in 1859, the debates that had made him, Lincoln, famous. Stephen Douglas was probably the most powerful politician in the country. And he quotes Douglas at the top of his speech, saying, "Our fathers, when they framed the government under which we live, understood this question just as well and even better than we do now." And Lincoln does something that good lawyers, debaters, politicians do all the time. He took his opponent's words and turned them. He says, "I fully endorse this, and I adopt it as a text for this discourse. And I so adopt it because it furnishes a precise and agreed starting point for a discussion between the Republicans and that wing of the democracy headed by Senator Douglas." That wing of the democracy is a reference to the fact that Stephen Douglas and President James Buchanan, the two leading Democrats in the country, were engaged in a blood feud by that point. And this had involved regional differences, even though Buchanan was from the North as well. He was representing the Southern interests of the party, and Douglas was representing the Northern interests of the party by this point. And it was all about the role of the federal government in determining the future of slavery in the territories, as you will find out. Because what Lincoln says next is that the sum of the whole is that of our 39 fathers, the 39 signers of the Constitution, who framed the original Constitution, 21, Lincoln says, a clear majority of the whole, certainly understood, and this is the key point, that no proper division of local from federal authority, nor any part of the Constitution forbade the federal government to control slavery in the federal territories. This is what the debate had become about. The question of whether or not the federal government could prevent the spread of slavery into the Western territories. Lincoln and the Republicans said it could. The Supreme Court, led by Roger Brooke Taney, said it couldn't. It said that the Constitution did not allow for the Congress to prohibit slavery in the territories. This was a position that James Buchanan, the president, supported, and Southerners in the Democratic Party also supported. This was a position that by now Stephen Douglas had more or less repudiated in preference for his policy, which was that the people in the territories should decide for themselves what was right or wrong. And Lincoln is taking Douglas's views and trying to turn them on him by conducting what will be an exhaustive analysis of the Founding Fathers, the framers of the original Constitution, and the members of the first Congresses, and how they voted on the questions of what was or was not prohibited in the territories. Lincoln says, "It is surely safe to assume that the 39 framers of the original Constitution and the 76 members of the Congress which framed the amendments thereto, taken together, do certainly include those who may be fairly called to be our fathers who framed the government under which we live." Now he's quoting Douglas. "And so assuming," Lincoln says, "I defy any man to show that any one of them ever, in his whole life, declared that in his understanding any proper division of local from federal authority or any part of the Constitution forbade the federal government to control as to slavery in the federal territories." I go a step further, he adds. I defy anyone to show that any living man in the whole world ever did, prior to the beginning of the present century, meaning the 19th century, declared that in his understanding any proper division of local from federal authority or any part of the Constitution forbade the federal government to control as to slavery in the federal territories. Now, I know this sounds like a dense legal argument, but this was the hottest, most controversial argument of the day in February 1860. Lincoln goes on, piling evidence upon evidence that indicates how much research he had done into the question of the original intent of the framers. And then finally he says, but enough. Let all who believe that, quote, our fathers who framed the government under which we live understood this question just as well and even better than we do now, end quote, speak as they spoke and act as they acted upon. He says this is all Republicans ask, all Republicans desire in relation to slavery. As those fathers marked it, so let it be marked, as an evil not to be extended. Note that despite all this legalism, Lincoln is still saying that all of it amounts to a recognition that slavery is evil. It might exist, but it needs to be contained and ultimately extinguished. As an evil not to be extended, but to be tolerated and protected only because of, and so far as its actual presence among us makes that toleration and protection a necessity. Let all the guarantees those fathers gave it be not grudgingly, but fully and fairly maintained. For this Republicans contend, and with this, so far as I know or believe, they will be content. Now here, he doesn't say that slavery will be ultimately extinguished, but he has said that in other places, and he will say this in other parts of the speech. What he means by saying that the fathers' guarantees should be fully and fairly maintained is that the Southerners themselves should ultimately come to the decision on their own to extinguish slavery. And this is what he turns to next. He says, I would address a few words to the Southern people. Now, for those of you who read speeches closely, you're always asking yourself, what is the audience? Well, Lincoln, as a speaker, in particular during the 1850s, is very determined to direct his points to particular audiences. In this speech, he will turn at one point to Southerners and then at another point to Republicans. Here he turns to Southerners. He says, I would say to them, you consider yourselves a reasonable and a just people, and I consider that in general qualities of reason and justice, you are not inferior to any other people. Still, when you speak of us Republicans, you do so only to denounce us as reptiles, or at best as no better than outlaws. Lincoln can be blunt, but he is trying to be persuasive. He is reaching out to his enemies and trying to talk sense to them. You will grant a hearing to pirates or murderers, but nothing like it to, quote, black Republicans. The Democrats, especially Southern Democrats, always referred to Republicans as black Republicans. That was a race stigma that they were attaching in an era when white Americans dominated the political culture. And he addresses the question of black republicanism at length. And then he turns to the issue that in February 1860 was looming largest in all of their minds. And that was the recent raid at Harper's Ferry in October 1859 by John Brown. And then John Brown's execution, which had occurred just in December of 1859. Lincoln is being almost defensive here. You have to read this carefully. He says, John Brown's effort was peculiar. It was not a slave insurrection. It was an attempt by white men to get up a revolt among slaves in which the slaves refused to participate. In fact, it was so absurd, he says, that the slaves, with all their ignorance, saw plainly enough that it could not succeed. Lincoln wasn't as harsh in his condemnation of Brown's raid immediately after it occurred, but he was always keeping a distance between the tactics of John Brown and the tactics of the Republican Party. He admitted at various points that Republicans and abolitionists like Brown shared a common view of slavery as evil. But he denied that the kind of slave insurrection that Brown was trying to foment was what the Republicans were trying to do, and he did not want voters to think the Republicans were militants like John Brown. He then ends his section addressing Southerners by saying, but will you break up the Union rather than submit to a denial of your constitutional rights? That has a somewhat reckless sound, but it would be palliated, meaning softened, if not fully justified, were we proposing by the mere force of numbers to deprive you of some right plainly written down in the Constitution. But, he says, we are proposing no such thing. And this is a very important argument he has with the Southerners, Southern Democrats in particular. When you make these declarations, you have a specific and well understood allusion to an assumed constitutional right of yours to take slaves into the federal territories and to hold them there as property. And now here he is completely explicit. But, he says, there is no such right specifically written in the Constitution. That instrument is literally silent about any such right. Your purpose, then plainly stated, is that you will destroy the government unless you be allowed to construe and enforce the Constitution as you please on all points in dispute between you and us. You will rule or ruin in all events. Unlike Douglas, the Southerners are on even shakier ground when it comes to interpreting the intent of the framers, and Lincoln says to them that they cannot claim a right that is not literally in the Constitution, and that the Republicans will not concede it to them. He turns to the Republicans to say this at the end. He says a few words now to Republicans. He warns them first to try to be respectful of the differences. Wrong as we think slavery is, he says, we can yet afford to let it alone where it is, because that much is due to the necessity arising from its actual presence in the nation. But can we, he adds, while our votes will prevent it, allow it to spread to the national territories and to overrun us here in the free states? This he won't allow. If our sense of duty forbids this, then let us stand by our duty, fearlessly and effectively. Let us be diverted by none of these sophistical contrivances, meaning sophistry, false arguments, and wherewith we are so industriously plied and belabored, contrivances such as groping for some middle ground between the right and the wrong. This is all a reference to Stephen Douglas and his third way, this middle ground that Lincoln thinks of as pure sophistry. He says, it is vain as the search for a man who should be neither a living man nor a dead man, such as a policy of don't care on a question about which all true men do care. The don't care policy is a direct reference to Stephen Douglas's claim that he doesn't care whether slavery is voted up or down in the territories, as long as the people out there decide for themselves. Lincoln says, such as union appeals beseeching true union men to yield to disunionists, reversing the divine rule and calling not the sinners but the righteous to repentance. And then he ends with a call for radicalism, not a call for violence and militants, but a call for radicalism among Northern Republicans. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. It was a stirring climax that brought the audience to its feet and helped secure Lincoln's place as one of the leading contenders for the Republican nomination. He was not the front runner yet, but it was clear he was capable. He had played on the biggest stage in American politics, and he had turned into a star.